Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, whichever time of day you're going to be viewing this. Before I begin this quick eTutor presentation, I just want to apologize for the tardiness. I had some difficulty uploading the PowerPoint with audio, and I then changed it into a YouTube channel, and only to find out that the audio was too low. Anyhow, my apologies again, so I'll just get started. For this evening, afternoon, morning, I'll just be going through briefly persona, speaker, tips for identifying the speaker and persona in a poem, understanding the tone, and just some things that come to mind when you hear the tone. So just how you're going to identify again the tone. So the beginning of the first slide, just going to introduce you to a short definition of what the speaker or persona is in a poem. And here it reads, the speaker is the voice or persona of a poem. One should not assume that the poet is the speaker, because the poet may be writing from a perspective entirely different from his own. So even with the voice of another gender, so therefore the speaker doesn't necessarily have to be the poet. So it could be a male or female. It can be another race or species. So in other words, it can be an animal. Or if I can add, it can be a supernatural figure. So it can be a spirit, a wizard, or witch, etc. Or even a material object. So the voice can be a chair, a pencil, or a tree. Also, to identify the persona or speaker in a poem, it's always important to examine other elements of the poem. So rather than just getting into determining who the speaker or persona is, because there are other information that might be relevant in the poem itself that might help you to conclude who the person or the voice is. So some of the elements may include the situation, the structure, descriptive details, or figurative or literal language that the poet is using, and also the rhythm can help to determine the speaker's identity. Our next slide is going to just look very quickly at 7 steps that you can use in identifying the speaker or persona, and I also use the word tips. So 7 stages or tips that you can use to help you to identify the speaker. So the first one, I advise students who can perhaps read the poem all the way through once without stopping to ask questions. So in this stage, you're going to simply just perhaps write down an immediate impression of the speaker in the poem. And a question that might generate this process is, what kind of speaker do you think, or what kind of speaker do you imagine in your mind? And as you do this, what you're expected to do in this stage is jot down anything that comes to mind. So this is really the first impression of the speaker. The second tip, read the poem again. So give it a second read, making notes in the margin and asking questions. So this, again, each tip or each stage will generate questions. So here you're going to ask yourself the question, what is this poem about? And in asking yourself the question, you're going to pay attention to the title. So titles often hints at the situation or meanings of the poem. So again, this process will perhaps involve underlining words or images repeated by the speaker. Repetition creates emphasis. So an emphasis might reveal the concerns and attitudes of the speaker towards the subject of the poem. The third tip will help you to determine the situation of the poem. So some of the questions that might generate this stage would be, for example, what is happening when the poem begins? What is the subject the speaker is addressing? Or you might want to describe the setting portrayed in the descriptive images. So a question that will go along with this would be perhaps, are they taken from nature or the city? Or is there a specific location or a generalized setting? So for example, if you look back at Claude McKay's Harlem Dancer, the setting was a bar. The situation was, for example, a prostitute dancing and onlookers looking at her, and she was feeling very detached. So that was the situation, and the focus was very much on the dancer herself, right? The second stage or tip would be to examine the kinds of language used by the speaker. So again, asking your question, is it formal or colloquial, as in, is the voice everyday speech, everyday language? Are there therefore any reference to a particular situation or to an internal state of mind? So notice here the focus of the speaker is, for example, the question might gear this section is, what is he or she paying attention to? If you go back to Edward Baugh's poem, The Carpenter's Complaint, we can surmise that. Remember, he was using colloquial speech, so everyday language, and the situation or his internal state of mind was one of disappointment and distress because his best friend had passed away, and his best friend's son had overlooked his services, not using him to build his coffin. Stage 5, which would be in our next slide, we'll be looking at determining the overall emotion, or excuse me, let me go back to the next one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, determining the overall emotion of the poem. So actually this would be tip 4. There's some errors in the numerical errors. So anyhow, stage 4 or tip 4 would be, determining the overall emotion of the poem. So in this section, as you determine the overall emotion of the poem, this is where now you're going to perhaps ask yourself the question, is the speaker reflective, excited, nostalgic, worried, optimistic, angry, etc. And also, while you're in this stage, it's good to also analyze the language for words that suggest mood. So are there specific colors that are being used? Colors are very good in terms of representation and symbolic meaning. So, whereas maybe green is being used in a particular way. Other words that can be very representative or symbolic are sounds and images. Another thing that we might be able to look for here in determining the overall emotion of the poem is describing the rhythm of the speaker's voice to help determine his or her attitude. So in other words, you might want to ask yourself, is the rhythm gentle and flowing, or is it choppy, or is it very abrupt and short? And this would be number 5. Again, I apologize for the numerical error. And then we move on to 6, where in this stage, you're now involved, you're now engaging yourself. So you're not going to be asking yourself all those questions, because now you've given the poem a close reading, a close analysis. So this is a stage now where you write a brief description of the speaker's physical appearance, and by doing so, you might want to get his or her age, the gender, the social status, or any other details that might help to bring the speaker to life. Bearing in mind, though, if the details in the poem are not specific about these characteristics, use the context of the poem to speculate. And then the last stage or step or tip, you'd review now the notes, so everything that you've gathered in stage 6, the analysis, the close reading, you'll now review that during your analysis of the poem, and you'll draw out conclusion about the speaker. So just very briefly write a character sketch of the speaker based on the notes taken from that analysis or close reading. Our next slide that we're going to move on to is going to be looking at understanding tone. So understanding tone, I'll just quickly read through the 3 very brief definitions that were given to you on your sheet. And the first one was, tone refers to speaker's attitude to his or her own listener. And the second one that was given by Thomas Arp and Craig Johnson was a more expansive definition than the first one, where he also, or they, didn't just limit the speaker's attitude to his or her listener, but they also expanded to his or her theme, the attitude, tying it to theme, audience, and also him or herself, so to the poet. And the last definition was also much more expansive than the other 2, where Roberts links tone not just to listener and audience, but also to the ways in which the writer or speaker reveal attitudes or feelings. And our last slide we're going to look at now is how to describe a tone, or as it was written in on your sheet, some things that come to mind when you see or hear the word tone. Because remember, again, it's easier to detect tone in vocalizing, so in speaking, like for now you might be able to detect my tone, as opposed to when it's in written form. So this is just a very quick way in which you can determine or help to describe the tone, which one, to figure out the tone of a poem, you must feel out the writer's attitude toward the audience or subject. So how is, feel out the emotion that's being conveyed or projected by the writer or poet. A poem of praise conveys a tone of approval, while, for example, a satirical poem conveys an ironical tone or expression. Also bearing in mind that tone can be formal, it can be informal, playful, angry, serious, or humorous. And the tone of a poem can even change throughout the poem. So tones are not always consistent. So while the poem might start out in a very gloomy, sad, it might in fact change to a very happy, vibrant, lively tone. Finally, in describing a poem's tone, you may use any kind of adjectives you wish, as long as it accurately conveys your interpretation of the writer's attitude toward the subject or the audience.